Over 60 years ago, a battle was fought in this great Russian city that would be the turning point of the Second World War. It was one of the longest and hardest fought battles of all time.
For 5 months, German and Soviet troops fought each other street by street, building by building, and room by room.
Ferocious German attacks met exceptionally stiff Soviet resistance. It led to the most intense fighting of the Second World War.
I'll be revealing what it was really like for the soldiers on the ground.
And I'll be explaining how the leaders' tactics drove their armies to the brink of destruction. The stakes could not have been higher. The outcome of the entire war hung on what happened here in 1942, in the Battle of Stalingrad. In the summer of 1941, the world was at war. Adolf Hitler's ruthless ambition and overwhelming military strength made Nazi Germany seem unstoppable. Hitler was at the peak of his power. He and his allies dominated Europe and North Africa. He'd seized France, the Netherlands, most of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. And then he launched the biggest invasion force in history, more than 3 million men, at the Soviet Union. He was determined to destroy communism and expand his empire still further. By the spring of 1942, after 9 months of fighting, the Germans had pressed deep into Soviet territory, but failed to secure complete victory. So in April, Hitler drew up a new battle plan. In the far south of the country, there were vast oil reserves, crucial to the Soviet war effort. Hitler wanted to stop the oil getting to Soviet troops and industry, first by preventing oil tankers transporting it up the river Volga, and then by seizing the oil fields themselves. Oil was the key to the war. Hitler knew Stalin would fight tooth and nail to protect his oil. Without it, the Soviet war machine would grind to a halt. In May 1942, Hitler put his plan into action. He sent 2 million men, nearly 2/3 of all his troops in the Soviet Union, through the Russian steppe towards the oil fields.
With the hot sun beating down on them, the German troops sped across southern Russia. Despite pockets of fierce resistance, they seemed unstoppable. Some of them even felt like heroes, pioneers of a new empire for the German people.
What great spaces the Soviets occupy. What rich fields there are to be had here after the war is over. Only, let's get it over with quickly. I believe that the Führer will carry the thing through to a successful end.
The speed of the German advance, their technical superiority, and the experience of their troops was too much for the Soviets. Throughout May and June 1942, Soviet troops fell back in widespread disarray. Hundreds of thousands were killed or wounded as they conceded swathes of land to the advancing Germans. And for civilians, the arrival of German forces into their villages was a terrifying prospect. Nazis murdered, raped, looted without hesitation. Villagers could see the dust cloud from approaching German tanks up to 40 miles away, and they knew that there was little they could do to escape. Some were rounded up and transported to prison camps. Others were killed on the spot and their bodies discarded.
The world has never seen a more cursed enemy. I have seen how the enemy treats the civilian population, stealing everything and killing wives and children. If I'm killed, let my sons make the enemy pay tenfold. I urge my sons to avenge their father's blood.
Throughout June and July 1942, Hitler's generals reported German victories ever deeper into southern Russia. Hitler was so confident and impatient for victory that he decided to alter his plan of attack. Instead of trying first to block the Volga and then take the oil fields, he decided to attack both targets at the same time. One army would drive south to the oil fields. The other would seize a city on the banks of the Volga that would give them a stranglehold on the river's vital supply line. It was the city that bore the name of the Soviet leader himself. Its name was Stalingrad. Stalingrad was one of the most vibrant cities in southern Russia. Huge factories made equipment for the army. And workers could relax by strolling along the grand boulevards and parks leading down to the banks of the river. The city was the showpiece of the Soviet Union and its leader, Stalin. Joseph Stalin was a ruthless dictator. Stalin wasn't his real name, but it meant man of steel and fitted his terrifying reputation. His orders had led to the death of millions of Soviet citizens. He had absolute control over the Soviet war effort and was now increasingly alarmed by the German advance. Faced with a threat to his oil fields and to the city of Stalingrad, Stalin decided to take desperate measures to stiffen Soviet resistance. In July 1942, his order went out. From now on, there would be no step backwards. Surrender or retreat would not be tolerated. Deserters and cowards would be shot.
Throughout Stalingrad, over 750,000 people were told to get ready for war on their doorstep. Anti-aircraft guns were placed on the high ground, and the civilians helped the military in the desperate attempt to prepare the city's defences. Women and children helped dig anti-tank trenches and built bomb shelters under the city streets. Soviet soldiers began to surround the city, and brutal anti-German propaganda filled the newspapers. One very famous piece of Soviet propaganda was published in the form of a poem. It urged Soviet troops to kill Germans. It said, "Kill him, so tears should flow in his home, not in yours. Kill him, every time you see him." The tone was being set for one of the most savage battles in modern history. On the 23rd of August 1942, aircraft of the German Luftwaffe began a colossal aerial assault on Stalin's city. German pilots flew 2,000 sorties, dropping 1,000 tons of bombs in 48 hours. Even more than was dropped on London at the height of the Blitz. Incendiary bombs turned neighbourhoods of wooden houses into infernos. Even the modern brick buildings of the city centre were gutted by flame. The air was thick with smoke, and in every direction, the city was ablaze. Homes and factories burned uncontrollably through the night. Bombs hit fuel storage tanks on the riverbank, unleashing torrents of burning oil onto the water. A column of black smoke rose over 3.5 kilometers into the sky. The first few days of the bombardment, civilians were refused permission to evacuate the city. Their only chance of survival lay in finding shelter in basements and cellars. But for many it was hopeless. Over 25,000 Russians died in just 2 days.
There are planes flying day and night. My heart is bursting. I don't know what to do and what's going to happen to us. I have got nowhere to go to, and I don't want to die here. You say to me in each letter that we'll see each other soon. Your words make me glad, my dear, but it seems to me that we're unlikely ever to meet. I think we have already parted forever.
Stalingrad was all but destroyed. Its elegant avenues and grand buildings had been bombed to ruins. But the fight for Stalingrad was only just beginning. It was about to enter a new and even more deadly phase.
Hitler now ordered over 100,000 ground troops to seize Stalingrad and deliver him a rapid victory. The task was given to the men of the 6th Army. It was Hitler's most powerful and best equipped force. They'd stormed through Poland, France and the Ukraine and never known defeat. Their commander was General Friedrich Paulus. He was a fine strategic planner, but not an inspiring leader. Above all else, he was totally loyal to Hitler. As his armies swept towards Stalingrad, Paulus set up his headquarters in this small village, 30 miles to the west of the city. Paulus understood his task very clearly. Hitler wouldn't be content just with occupying Stalingrad. He wanted it annihilated. All Paulus had to decide was his line of attack. Paulus cast his eyes over maps on this very table. In front of him, Stalingrad sprawled for 30 miles along the west bank of the river Volga. It divided roughly into 3 areas. A factory zone in the north here, a civic centre here, and residential suburbs further south. The Germans, shown here in blue, had reached the Volga to the north and to the south of the city. The Soviet Red Army had been pushed back and were now isolated and outnumbered 2 to 1. With the river at their backs, the Soviets were now entirely dependent on supplies and reinforcements being ferried across the Volga from the east bank to the west. Stalingrad looked easy prey for Paulus. Paulus's plan for a ground assault targeted 2 key landmarks in the city. The central landing stage, where the Red Army unloaded their supplies, and this prominent hill, Mamayev Kurgan. It was the city's highest point. If Paulus could capture this, his guns would have the river and most of Stalingrad in their sights. You can see at a glance how vital this hill is. Commanding the city as it does, right the way along the Volga River, from the industrial area behind me down to the city centre right there. At dawn on the 14th of September, just 2 weeks after the Luftwaffe air raids, Paulus put his plan into action. The city shuddered from the ferocity of the onslaught. And with each passing hour, the Soviets were rapidly losing control. In little over 24 hours, German forces had stormed the southern part of the city. The main railway station was in their control, and the landing stage was surrounded and under heavy fire. Mamayev Kurgan, the city's highest point, was also under attack from the Germans.
The main Soviet force defending the city was the 62nd Army, but it had been battered by air raids and was having difficulty holding off the German attacks. Its men were outnumbered, exhausted, and dispirited.
But what they did have was a tough new commander. His name, General Vasily Chuikov. He was chosen for being a dogged and instinctive fighter with an almost unshakable nerve. But he knew his troops inside the city were on the verge of collapse. Chuikov's only hope of preventing the immediate fall of Stalingrad lay on the opposite bank of the River Volga.
Here on the east bank, there were 10,000 Soviet reinforcements preparing to enter the city. They were elite troops, but they were short of ammunition, and 1 in 10 of them didn't even have a rifle. Nevertheless, at 7 p.m., they received orders to cross. Heavy German artillery fire rained down on the boats crossing the river. The water soon filled with burning debris and floating human remains. As the troops neared the shore, the scale of the devastation would have become clear. They would even have been able to smell the stench of corpses rotting in the summer heat. But there was no chance of turning back.
Chuikov's reinforcements were thrown straight into the heart of the battle. Some stormed the shore and secured the landing stage. From there, they moved quickly through the streets in order to retake the main railway station. Others joined the battle for Mamayev Kurgan, where the fighting was increasingly ferocious.
Artillery fire had turned this whole hilltop into a moonscape of blackened craters. It was also deafeningly noisy. One Russian soldier compared it to having steel needles pushed through his eardrums into his brain. Bodies of the dead and wounded lay everywhere throughout the city.
We're often sent into battle armed with nothing but our bare hands. And this is happening not just to our division, but to others too. People, hungry and exhausted, launch into battle with bare hands. That's how we are fighting. Things are bad.
Despite all this, the reinforcements held up the German advance, at least for the time being. But it came at a terrible cost. 80% of those Soviet reinforcements were killed or wounded within a week.
Churikov had averted a disaster, and he'd also sent Paulus a clear message. Stalingrad would be defended no matter what the human cost. But Churikov knew that if he was to hold on, he'd have to go further. He'd have to find some weakness in the seemingly invincible German army. The German military tactics, which had been so effective in the war across Europe, relied on carefully coordinated attacks from aircraft of the German Luftwaffe and tanks on the ground. In wide open territory, this combination had made the Germans unstoppable. But the fight for Stalingrad was now confined to the streets of a ruined city. Churikov realized this gave him a chance to outsmart the German tactics. Churikov told his men to stick so close to the Germans, the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb them without fear of hitting its own men. What's more, the streets were so full of rubble and collapsed buildings that the German tanks found it difficult to maneuver. They were particularly vulnerable fighting at close quarters. Churikov said, "Every German must be made to feel he lives under the muzzle of a Russian gun."
Our troops are often separated from the enemy by only a few dozen meters. While the enemy holds one part of the building, we hold another. It often comes to hand-to-hand fighting. The hand grenade, the bottle of incendiary fluid, the bayonet. Such are the weapons which are often used in street and house-to-house fighting.
The Soviet troops did their best. But the Germans' overwhelming firepower was still too much for them. On the 26th of September, the Germans declared that they controlled the entire south and center of the city. But Churikov's troops still stubbornly refused to give in. And now, hiding in the ruins of the city, they found a new way to strike back at the Germans. Snipers were an invisible predator that could kill without warning.
To find out more about why snipers were so effective in Stalingrad, Dan and I went to the British Army's Sniper Training Centre in Wales. I would take on the role of a German commander, and Dan would be part of a Soviet sniper team.
What we have set up here, Peter, is your headquarters, and it would be far enough back from the front line to provide you with some limited protection, but it would be close enough for you to influence the battle.
My headquarters also had radio operators working inside, and a machine gunner to protect me. The task for Dan and his sniper team was to disable the headquarters, either by shooting me or my team. In this exercise, it would count as a hit if the sniper could identify the letter written on my helmet and then fire a blank round. We also gave a letter to the machine gun sentry. So the targets were Q, Quebec, and D, Delta.
A sniper's first job is to find a hiding place from where they can fire at the enemy.
So what are you seeing, Dean? Anything suspicious?
Not yet. Keep looking, hopefully we'll be able to locate anyone that's out there, any suspicious movement.
It could be anywhere. If there's
Absolutely.
a sniper in there, it could be anywhere.
Yep.
It would have been extremely difficult in a large city that'd been so devastated like Stalingrad to identify a sniper moving around and in position.
We'd managed to get into our building without being spotted, but to stay hidden, we had to change our camouflage to blend in with the new environment, just like the snipers in Stalingrad.
They would have something just like this, so they would get different colours of paint, mud, dirt, and just paint the whole thing up. Bearing in mind, all the contacts, all the firing was at really short distance, so the better they could blend in, the better for them if they had been detected.
Our plan was that rather than attacking the front, we would cover the rear exit from the headquarters.
Okay, you can see straight through there. That is a target area with us, so that looks to be like a HQ.
It was now just a question of sitting and waiting, but without losing my concentration.
As I'm sitting here, I'm realising that one of the real challenges to being a sniper is maintaining that focus, and the guys at Stalingrad would be doing that for a day or even longer. And you just don't know when the target's going to appear, and as a result, you've got to be, your nerves are on edge the whole time.
While we kept watch at the back, 2 more snipers, the rest of our team, climbed into position in a small building directly in front of the headquarters.
But if they were in one of these buildings, they'd be using the shadow inside the building to hide themselves, set back from the window, nice and still.
The team at the front were now in position. They decided to attack the machine gunner because he was the most immediate threat.
Okay, enemy on target.
Seen.
Delta. Wait.
If he's a reasonably trained sniper who's well practiced, you would pretty much guarantee a hit with the first round.
Range 225 metres.
You should be able to achieve a shot onto your centre of mass at approximately 900 metres.
900 metres?
900 metres.
Shot from chest ahead.
Send it.
What's that?
Delta.
Target down.
We've got to move.
Delta confirm kill.
Inside the building, I thought I would be safe from the snipers. Right. We know he's out there somewhere.
Confirm 1 kill. Delta is down. All other call signs moved into the building.
With our target inside the building, we decided to use a tactic used by snipers in Stalingrad. We called in artillery fire onto his headquarters to force him out into the open.
Hi Zero, this is 20 Delta. All call signs in building. Request Alpha 1, 1 Alpha. Fires X-ray 001, 5 now, over.
Now they're shooting at us. Artillery.
Right, I see artillery going in now. So you should push them out to the back.
It would only be a matter of time before we got a direct hit from the mortars onto this location. We've got to move.
Okay. We decided to move to our vehicle at the back of the building and used smoke to hide ourselves from the snipers at the front.
We now have smoke being thrown obscuring our view.
Mortar's coming rather close.
Yeah, I can see a Q on his head.
I had a shot. I had a shot. It was somewhere over there. Goodness knows where.
I think that might have been Dad.
So that's me done for.
Absolutely.
Here they are. Hi, Dan. I had no idea where you were. No idea at all.
We could see you.
You sure you hit me?
Absolutely.
I mean, it really was quite frightening because I had absolutely no idea where you guys were. It just demonstrates how a very small number of people lightly equipped can keep a serious command post in real trouble. Well, really, really quite terrifying it must have been.
You don't see them at all. They have established themselves in houses and cellars and are firing on all sides, including from our rear. Barbarians. They use gangster methods.
Soviet snipers were very effective. The German troops knew that if they broke cover, they risked being shot. German snipers were soon brought into the city as well. And as the fighting raged above the ground, the soldiers were increasingly driven down into a terrifying new arena. Troops on both sides began to fight underground. Soldiers roamed through cellars, tunnels, and even sewers like this one, as they attempted to gain an advantage over the enemy. The German soldiers soon had a new name for this kind of fighting. They called it Rattenkrieg, War of the Rats. It was fighting of an intensity and terror unlike anything the soldiers had experienced before. It's hot, it's filthy, and it's stinking. And of course they knew that anywhere in the darkness, the enemy could be waiting for them.
I am alive, but in a moment I might be dead. You can get killed any second here. The fighting is very heavy, and so many people have been killed. Corpses lie on the ground, and it's dreadful to look. Our poor soldiers and Germans lie there rotting unwanted. Tanks drive over dead bodies as if they were logs of wood. The tanks are all covered in blood. It's a horror to see.
In mid-October, after over a month of fighting, buildings had been reduced to empty shells. Thousands of civilians were inside the city. Some stole food to survive, but many more died of starvation or from drinking polluted water. Alongside them in the ruins were tens of thousands of soldiers, also struggling to survive. The fight for Stalingrad had descended into a vicious series of battles over individual buildings, sometimes with the Soviets and the Germans on different floors of the same one. Troops could spend days trapped in a single room. In all the chaos, any sign of a clear front line simply vanished. But despite the tenacious Soviet defense, the Germans were increasing their stranglehold on the city.
The landing stage, where vital Russian supplies were brought across the river Volga, remained under heavy German fire. And fighting continued to rage for control of the city's highest point, Mamayev Kurgan. It had now changed hands several times, without either side establishing control. After 6 weeks of fighting, the German forces had managed to gain control of much of the shattered city. The Soviets only had this narrow strip of land, but somehow they were clinging on. Hitler was becoming increasingly impatient and demanded Paulus launch a decisive blow, this time on Stalingrad's industrial heart, the factories in the north of the city. They were the Soviets' last major refuge. If they lost these, they would have almost nothing left of the city. Their key stronghold was the tractor factory that dominated the entire area.
The factory had been converted to tank production to support the war effort, and despite the battle raging around it, tanks continued to roll out through its gates. A lack of raw materials meant they couldn't actually make new tanks here, but they could repair battle-damaged ones and get them back into operation. Sometimes they were driven straight out into combat by the factory workers themselves. but that was soon to end. On October the 14th, the attack on the factories began. Luftwaffe air raids blitzed the entire factory district. Planes flew 3,000 sorties a day, even more than in the original blitz on the city 7 weeks earlier. Supported by 200 tanks, thousands of German infantry began to storm the factory complex. Explosions shattered these enormous windows, sending deadly shards of glass raining down on the troops below. Even by the brutal standards of Stalingrad, it was clear that the fight for the city had reached a new level of ferocity. "8,000 Soviet commandos tried to defend the factory, but soon the walls were covered with blood. Over half of them were killed or wounded, including their commander. He was buried alive up to his neck in rubble when his command post received a direct hit. He was rescued a few hours later, but he collapsed in shock when he tried to tell General Chuikov what had happened.
With the resistance in the factories crumbling, Chuikov realized that even he would now have to retreat. The German advance through the factory district forced Chuikov to pull his headquarters back here to the bank of the Volga. He was suffering severe casualties. More than a quarter of all his men had been killed or wounded since the attacks on the factories began. Units which had come to Stalingrad with 7,000 or 8,000 men were now down to a few hundred survivors. The Soviets were once again staring defeat in the face. The unrelenting German attacks had forced Chuikov's troops back into a handful of enclaves, only 200 meters, just over 200 yards deep in some places. One up here in the north. Another toehold in the factory area. And the larger area further south. Chuikov had lost 90% of Stalingrad, but still refused to admit defeat.
The battle was well into its third month, and the heat of the summer was a distant memory. Temperatures had plummeted to well below zero. But just as it seemed that things couldn't get any worse for Chuikov's men, the river Volga started to freeze. This made it hard for boats to ferry supplies into the city. The men were cold, hungry, exhausted, and running out of ammunition.
Everyone has lost the belief that we will hold Stalingrad. No, it's clear. We will not be victorious. Our poor motherland, you have been crippled and dropped into the abyss.
Hitler was now convinced that the city was finally in his grasp. In a speech to party veterans on the 8th of November, he effectively claimed victory. But the Germans were in for a dreadful shock, because while Hitler was obsessed with the fighting in the city, Stalin's high command had been planning a bold offensive that would change the course of the whole battle. On the 19th of November, the Soviets launched one of the most awesome counterattacks in modern history. Field guns, mortars, and rockets began a ferocious bombardment 75 miles to the west of Stalingrad. It was the earth-pounding product of 2 months' secret planning. For 80 minutes, artillery thundered. Then, at 8:40 a.m., they suddenly fell silent.
Just minutes later, wave upon wave of Soviet tanks broke out from beneath their camouflage. The key phase of the Soviet battle plan was now underway. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops and thousands of tanks had been hidden in the countryside around Stalingrad, and now they were on the attack. The weather was appalling. Snow and freezing fog made it almost impossible to see where they were going. Urged on by their commanders, the troops surged forward. Infantrymen carrying their rifles ran alongside the tank, and some even hitched a ride. They clung on the back up here as the tank plunged through gullies and banks of snow. These men were leading a great Soviet comeback, thrusting deep into enemy-held territory.
Paulus got the news at his headquarters here. This is it on our map case, right here. The German front line ran from down here through Stalingrad in front of Paulus and right the way back to his rear. It was here in the north that the Soviets had mustered a massive force which had broken through behind Paulus. There was even worse news to come. Just 24 hours later, more Soviet tanks broke through the front line in the south and headed north to link up with the others. Soviet forces were closing like huge jaws around Paulus and his entire 6th Army. On the 24th of November, the jaws closed near the town of Kalach. The terrible reality dawned on Paulus. As many as 300,000 men in Stalingrad and the surrounding countryside were trapped in an area that became known as the Kessel, the German word for cauldron.
The Soviet troops were jubilant. They had outwitted and outmaneuvered the Germans. Just 5 days before, the Soviets had been on the brink of defeat in Stalingrad.
Paulus was stunned. No one had believed the Soviets had the strength to mount such a massive operation. Paulus asked Hitler permission to withdraw from Stalingrad and to punch a hole in the ring of Soviet troops surrounding him. But just like Stalin 4 months earlier, Hitler told his troops there was no question of their being allowed to withdraw from Stalingrad. Hitler ordered his troops inside the Kessel to continue fighting, while he prepared 2 tank divisions to break through the encirclement from the outside. But it would take weeks for the forces to get into position and ready for the assault. Inside the Kessel, cut off from their supply lines, conditions for the trapped German troops were deteriorating rapidly.
Food, fuel, and ammunition were all running out. To make matters worse, many of the German soldiers had never received their winter uniforms. There was little they could do except huddle together in whatever shelter they could find.
Hitler's decision to leave his army trapped inside the Kessel was an enormous gamble. He believed he would be able to keep them fighting with the support of an airlift. Flying supplies into airfields in the Kessel was a huge undertaking. There were 300,000 troops trapped around here, and Hitler's staff calculated that it would require 800 cargo planes flying night and day. It was an extraordinarily ambitious plan, but the head of the German Air Force, the bombastic Hermann Göring, convinced Hitler that it would work. To succeed, they would need to land here at airfields in the Kessel an absolute minimum of 300 tons of supplies every single day. But they had made some fatal miscalculations. Within days of the airlift starting, it became clear that Hitler and Göring had massively overestimated the capacity of their air force to supply the 6th Army. combination of Soviet fighter aircraft and appalling weather meant that on average only 120 tons of supply reached the Kessel each day, less than half of what was required.
We have no winter clothes. We have been swindled and have been condemned to death. We shall die of the war or the frost.
Inside Stalingrad, the fighting continued, and the Soviets unleashed a new kind of assault. Day and night, loudspeakers throughout the Kessel broadcast propaganda messages in German. They called Stalingrad a mass grave and urged German soldiers to surrender.
I can tell you that it's terrible to sit in this trap. In the dugouts, it's dark. And outside, the temperature is minus 20 or 30. I can only say that if it wasn't for our strength of will and our inspiration in the fight for Germany, the whole business would have been broken long ago.
Despite the psychological battering, the frostbite and the starvation, most German troops still refused to surrender. Some feared that they'd be tortured or shot by their Russian captors, but most simply refused to believe that Hitler would abandon them. Then, at long last, a rumour went round that salvation was on the way.
2 German tank divisions, backed up by infantry and aircraft of the Luftwaffe, were on the way towards their colleagues trapped in the Kessel. Leading the attack was one of Hitler's most successful commanders. His name was Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. He had masterminded Germany's whirlwind victory in France, and now he was leading the mission to rescue the Sixth Army. With the airlift failing, everybody realized that this was the last chance for the starving troops. Manstein's tanks had to break through the front line, which was now down here, and then fight their way across the Soviet-controlled territory surrounding the Sixth Army. The German troops surged forwards towards their stranded colleagues, but within days, the Red Army intercepted the German advance 30 miles short of the trapped Sixth Army. The Soviet defenses had formed an impenetrable barrier, and Manstein's rescue attempt could advance no further. But on the 20th of December, the news got even worse. Manstein heard that the Soviets had launched a new offensive way off to the west, which threatened to cut off all the German forces in southern Russia. He had no choice but to veer off to deal with this new threat and abandon his attempt to break through to Paulus. With Manstein's departure went the last hope of the Sixth Army.
The Russian radio has announced the defeat of Manstein. Ahead of us is either death or captivity.
Realizing their fate, many German soldiers now wrote letters to their families.
We are men who know how to bear everything. The main thing is that you and the children are all right. Don't worry about me. Nothing can happen to me any longer. Today, I have made my peace with God. I give you all my love and 1,000 kisses. I love you to my last breath.
6 weeks into the encirclement, Soviet planes dropped thousands of leaflets into the Kessel. They promised the Germans safety, food, and medical attention if their commander conceded defeat. But the message ended with a chilling warning. If surrender was rejected, everyone inside the Kessel would be wiped out.
Once again, Hitler refused to allow his troops to surrender. So on the 10th of January 1943, the Soviets began the final operation to destroy all German troops that remained inside the Kessel.
Frozen, weakened by starvation and exhausted, the Sixth Army was no longer capable of defending itself properly. The only chance of escape was to make it to one of the 2 airstrips inside the Kessel and try to squeeze onto a plane. This is all that remains of Gumrak airfield, just west of Stalingrad. It's difficult to imagine the scene of chaos and desperation here in the new year of 1943. Everyone knew that each plane leaving here could be the last, and people were crushed in the fight to get aboard. Some desperate men even clung to the wings of taxiing aeroplanes, but as the pilots accelerated, one by one these men tumbled to the ground.
For 2 more weeks, German troops inside the Kessel were pushed relentlessly back. The German airfields were soon overrun. Now there was no way out. Survivors were chased into the freezing ruins of Stalingrad. Among them was General Paulus. Paulus moved his headquarters to the basement of this shop in the city centre. He was now a broken man. But Hitler wanted to portray Paulus and his Sixth Army as martyrs fighting to the death for Germany. And on the 31st of January 1943, Paulus received a message from Hitler promoting him to Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal had ever given himself up alive. And Hitler, no doubt, expected Paulus to commit suicide. Within hours, Soviet troops had surrounded Paulus. Trapped in his basement, he made his decision. At 7:45 a.m. on the 31st of January 1943, Paulus chose not to commit suicide, but to surrender himself. Under armed guard, he was taken to a house on the outskirts of the city. 2 days later, after 5 months of horror, the fighting finally ended. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The whole world had witnessed a catastrophic defeat for Hitler's Nazi empire. And for the Führer himself, it was a personal disaster. He'd been totally committed to victory and was now utterly humiliated. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Hitler's army for so long was gone forever. In Stalingrad alone, 150,000 German troops had been killed. And 90,000 more were now beginning the long, slow journey to Soviet prison camps. Only 5,000 of them would ever return home.
In this grassy field, on the outskirts of the city, was one of the last German command posts. It still bears the scars of battle. More than 60 years later, the evidence is everywhere. These are just some of the thousands of bones discovered every year. A gruesome reminder of the horrific death toll.
Although his city lay in ruins, Stalin had won. But victory had come at a terrible price. The Soviets lost more men and women during the Stalingrad campaign than Britain and America lost during the entire war. This park is a monument to the defenders of Stalingrad, who ultimately helped change the course of the Second World War. Stalingrad was the battle that marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Over the next 2 years, Stalin chased Hitler's armies all the way back to Berlin. In 1945, the Nazi Empire was finally crushed between Britain, America, and their allies in the West, and Soviet forces in the East. The irony is that Stalin went on to replace one oppressive empire in Eastern Europe with another of his own. And the Soviet Union, which had been the West's ally during the Second World War, became its bitter opponent during the Cold War, which lasted another half-century. Next time, we bring you the battle for Korea. I'll be describing the enormous shifts in the fortunes of the United Nations allies as they fought against a communist enemy.
And I'll be telling the story of what it was like for the ground troops when these two very different armies clashed.
In 3 long years of war, one of the most decisive battles was fought here. It was the Battle of the Imjin River.